right, everybody, get ready for a climb today, because we're tackling a mountain, a metaphor, of course, the 4 stages of enlightenment in Theravada Buddhism.
I love a good metaphor. And this one's perfect because it really highlights the gradual nature of enlightenment in this tradition.
Right, it's not like flipping a switch and bam, you're enlightened.
Exactly. It's a process, a journey with distinct stages, each offering a new perspective, like reaching a higher vantage point on a mountain.
And just like any good climb, we gotta start at the beginning.
So let's lace up those metaphorical hiking boots.
I'm ready, let's hit the trail. What's our first base camp on this climb to enlightenment?
First up is the Sotapanna stage, the stream enterer.
Stream enterer. Okay, I'm already intrigued. It sounds like we're diving right into some deep, mystical waters here.
It does have a certain ring to it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Picture this. You've just stepped onto the path at the foot of the mountain. There's this rushing stream beside you.
Okay, I'm visualizing it.
As a Sotapanna, you're no longer getting swept away by the currents of that stream, those currents representing the lower realms of existence.
Lower realms of existence. That sounds kind of ominous. What are we talking about here?
Well, it's not quite as dramatic as it sounds. Think of it like those negative thought loops we all get stuck in sometimes, those moments when you're just caught.
Like that feeling of, here we go again with a problem or worry you just can't seem to shake.
Exactly. Those lower realms are like those thought patterns that keep us tethered, that stop us from moving forward.
Okay, so as a Sotapanna, you're breaking free of that cycle, no longer getting pulled back into those same old patterns.
Precisely. You're dipping your toes into the stream of awareness, taking those first steps toward liberation.
Okay, I'm liking the sound of this. So how long does it take to go from dipping your toes to, like, full-on enlightenment? Asking for a friend.
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. The source material we're looking at indicates that once you've reached the Sotapanna stage, you're guaranteed to achieve full enlightenment within 7 lifetimes.
7 lifetimes. I mean, that's kind of comforting, I guess. No pressure to get it right this time around. But 7 lifetimes is a long time. Does that, like, make this life less important?
That's a great question, and it really makes you think about the nature of this journey, doesn't it? If enlightenment is this gradual unfolding, then maybe it's not so much about the finish line, but about how we choose to approach each step along the way.
So it's less about rushing towards enlightenment and more about, like, the intentionality behind each lifetime, making each one count.
Exactly. How do we want to live, knowing that this life is just one part of a much larger journey?
Now, that's a question worth pondering. Okay, so we're not rushing, we're being intentional with this life, but we're still climbing. What's next after we've dipped our toes in the stream?
So, from that first stage, Sotapanna, we move on to the second, Sakadagami, which translates to once returner.
Once returner. Okay, you're going to have to break that one down for me.
Remember how we were talking about those lower realms, those negative thought patterns that can kind of pull us back?
Yeah, like getting stuck in those mental ruts.
Right. Well, as a Sakadagami, you still might encounter those realms. You might even get pulled back in occasionally.
Okay, so it's not like you're completely immune to those negative thought patterns yet.
Exactly. But here's the key difference. You're not as stuck. You've gained some distance.
So you're saying instead of getting totally swept away by the current, you might get knocked off balance, but you're able to regain your footing more quickly.
That's a great way to put it. You're less controlled by those external circumstances, those cravings and aversions that used to have such a hold on you.
It's like you're stronger now, more able to resist the pull of those currents.
Exactly. The source material uses the analogy of reaching a plateau on a mountain climb. The air might be thinner, but the view is clearer. You can see further down the path.
I like that visual. So at this stage, it's less about being completely unaffected by those negative things and more about how we respond when they inevitably pop up.
Precisely. Imagine it's rush hour, you're stuck in traffic. Before, you might have completely lost it. But as a Sakadagami,
You're able to take a deep breath, maybe even find a little humor in the situation.
exactly, it's not about becoming emotionless, but rather about recognizing that those cravings and aversions don't have the same power over us anymore. We're less attached.
Okay, but does that mean we stop enjoying things? Like, can a Sakadagami even enjoy a good piece of chocolate cake? Asking for a friend?
Of course. It's not about denying ourselves pleasure. It's about recognizing that our happiness shouldn't depend solely on those external things.
So it's more about moderation, balance.
Yes, it's about finding a sense of peace and contentment that isn't so dependent on things always going our way or getting what we want, which, let's face it, is a pretty tall order.
It is. But hey, we're climbing a mountain here. We got to aim high, right? So we've got the stream enterer and the once returner. What's the next stage on this path to the peak?
Next, we climb even higher to the Anagami stage,
Hmm.
the non-returner.
Non-returner. Okay, that sounds pretty final. What's going on at this altitude? Non-returner. Okay, that sounds pretty final. What's going on at this altitude?
Things are getting pretty transcendent at this stage.
Transcendent, huh? Lay it on me.
Well, the term non-returner refers to the idea that at this stage, you've broken free from the cycle of rebirth in those lower realms.
Yeah.
You're basically on a one-way ticket to the top.
No more getting sidetracked on those lower slopes of negative thought patterns and cravings.
You got it. You've cultivated a deep understanding of impermanence,
Yeah.
of non-attachment,
Mm-hmm.
and those things just don't have the same pull anymore.
That's incredible. But I have to admit, this whole non-attachment thing, I wonder, does that mean you stop feeling joy? Like, can a non-returner still, I don't know, enjoy a beautiful sunset or a delicious meal? Or is it just like blissful indifference all the time?
That's such a common question.
Yeah.
And it's understandable. But no, non-attachment isn't about becoming indifferent. It's not about shutting down your emotions or experiences.
So it's not about denying those things, but maybe changing our relationship to them.
Exactly. You can still appreciate the beauty of that sunset, the taste of that meal, but it doesn't have the same hold on you. You're not defining yourself by those experiences or clinging to them as the source of your happiness.
And that makes sense. It's like you can appreciate those things without needing them to be permanent or to completely define your state of mind.
Exactly. And that's incredibly freeing. It allows you to experience the full spectrum of human emotions, joy, sadness, anger, without being completely ruled by them.
It's like you're finding a sense of peace and stability within that flow of life, rather than constantly chasing after fleeting moments of pleasure or trying to avoid discomfort.
Exactly. And that brings us finally to the peak of the mountain.
Arahant, right, the summit, full enlightenment. What does it look like to reach that final stage?
Arahant represents the culmination of this path. It's full liberation, freedom from suffering, from that cycle of birth and rebirth known as samsara.
We touched on samsara earlier, but I think it's worth another look. It's a pretty big concept.
Definitely. Think of samsara like a hamster wheel. You're constantly running, but not actually going anywhere. That's samsara, that endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, driven by our attachments, our cravings, our aversions.
It's like we're stuck in these repetitive patterns, these same old loops of thinking and behaving, even within a single lifetime.
Yes, exactly. Those thought loops, those arguments we have in our heads, those are all part of samsara. And an arahant, someone who's reached full enlightenment, has stepped off that hamster wheel entirely.
Wow. Okay, so what happens when an arahant dies? Do they just come back for another spin on the wheel, but this time with, like, VIP access?
Not quite. This is where things get really fascinating. Theravada Buddhism talks about parinirvana, which literally means final nirvana. When an arahant dies, they don't get reborn into any realm at all.
No more mountain climbing, no more plateaus, no more anything. That's it.
It's complete transcendence of all realms, of all limitations.
So no more self, as we understand it. That's a lot to wrap your head around.
It really is. It makes you question everything you thought you knew about existence. And it really highlights how these stages aren't just about reaching some far-off state. They're about fundamentally changing how we understand ourselves and reality itself.
And speaking of understanding reality, there was a recurring theme throughout this material that I wanted to touch on, the 3 marks of existence.
Ah, yes. Anicca, Dukkha, and Anatta.
Can you give us a quick refresher on those?
Of course. Anicca means impermanence. It reminds us that everything is constantly changing. Nothing stays the same. Dukkha is often translated as suffering, but it's really more about that sense of unease, that dissatisfaction we feel when we cling to things that are temporary. And Anicca is non-self-incensed. The recognition that this idea of a solid, independent me is actually an illusion.
It's like those 3 marks are a crash course in how to actually live a fulfilling life. Because let's face it, if we can really grasp these concepts, that everything changes, that clinging to things causes suffering, and that this idea of a separate self is an illusion, well, maybe we can navigate those ups and downs with a little more grace.
Absolutely. The more we resist those truths, the more we suffer. But when we embrace impermanence, when we loosen our grip on that idea of a fixed self, we open ourselves up to a whole new way of being.
It reminds me of that quote by the Buddha. Pain is inevitable, suffering is optional.
And those 3 marks give us the tools to choose less suffering.
It's about changing our perspective, shifting our focus from trying to control everything to finding peace within the flow of life.
Exactly.
Well, this has been an incredible journey. I feel like we've scaled a mountain of insight today.
I've enjoyed it.
But all good climbs must eventually come to an end. And it's time for us to descend from this peak of enlightenment for now. Any final words of wisdom to leave our fellow climbers with?
Remember, enlightenment isn't a destination, it's a journey. Each step we take, each moment of awareness, each act of kindness brings us closer to that understanding, that peace we're all seeking.
Beautifully said. And on that note, thanks to you all for joining us on this enlightening deep dive. Until next time, keep those minds open, those intentions clear, and keep climbing.